Hey everyone, Jody here. Over the next few episodes, we're going to bring you some recent favorite conversations. They're worth listening to again if you've already heard them, and for many of you, you'll be hearing them for the very first time. Look, we're giving ourselves a little bit of a break over the next week or so. I'm at the TED conference all week doing some stuff related to that new series of mine, Good Sport. Nikki and Kelly are in the home stretch of the academic year. And most importantly, our researcher, Jacob Feldman, is getting married. So a much-deserved break, and congratulations to Jacob. We're all very excited about that. Okay, here we go with a recent favorite episode, and we will be back very soon with brand new episodes. Hello, and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, early October 1776, Benjamin Franklin has just been named the first American diplomat by the Continental Congress and is preparing for a trip to France. Franklin was 70 years old, very much an elder statesman of sorts at this point, and I don't know, sometimes we think about these late career diplomatic appointments as cushy gigs, like, hey, your new job is to go to Paris and attend fancy dinners. And there is a little bit of that in this story, as we will discuss. But of course, this is 1776. Revolution is in the air. The ink has barely dried on the Declaration of Independence. And France is a key ally in the fight for American independence. So let's talk about why Franklin goes to France just as war is breaking out at home. Our very special guest for this episode is Mike Duncan, history podcast royalty, I would say, the host of a number of epic history series, including the History of Rome and the ongoing Revolution series, each season or installment of which tells the story of a different revolution from England and Haiti and Russia and Mexico, and yes, the American Revolution, which he did back in 2014. And this is a long bio, Mike. You've done so much. His book is Hero of Two Worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution, which is very relevant to what we're discussing today. But Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I just want to be clear that I'm a Republican, small R Republican. So I reject being podcast royalty. I don't believe in aristocracy of the blood or any of those things. So we must make our own citizen-based Republican podcast.
Okay, yes, I appreciate that spirit. And that voice you hear, of course, is Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hey there.
And Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt is not here. Just a scheduling thing. Life happens, folks. She couldn't make it. But we're very excited to do this. And I should also point out that Mike is on tour this month as well. And we'll talk about that a little later. But depending on when you hear this, there's a decent chance he'll be in a town near you. So go check it out. But Mike, I know you wrote this book that is about, your guy, Marquis de Lafayette, and sort of you have that perspective about, one of the people that Franklin meets when he goes to France. But I went back and listened to the episode you did in 2014 about this time period, the fall of 1776, and you point out that there's a bit of an open question in America about what exactly we want out of the war. There's still this idea of is it full independence, or do we want to just extract some concessions from the king? And so can you just start there about kind of how open the questions were, and especially as it pertains to Ben Franklin, where's his head at as he heads over to France?
Well, yeah, I think it was less of an open question by the time Franklin is going over there than before. There had been, all through 73, 74, 75 and into 76, there's a very lively debate about what the point of all this is, what even the point of taking up arms is, because even after the war started, was this meant to be we need concessions from the people who we would continue to be our sovereign and the parliament, or are we going to break off and do independence? But by the end of 1776, I think that at least among the colonial elites, the idea was we're going for independence now. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where his head was at when he was going to France. And they realized, John Dickinson is one of the major grandees of this time period. And he's in the Second Continental Congress, and he's the one who's leading sort of the anti-independence movement. Yeah. He's the one who's making the very reasonable case. What are we going to do? Take on the entire British Empire and win? That's not reasonable. And you guys are kind of crazy to be pushing us in this direction. I think it's going to lead to our collective downfall. But they knew they were not going to be able to pull this off without bringing France into the war. They needed French money. They needed French arms. They needed French uniforms and boots and coats. They needed the French Navy. And this was something that was of absolute paramount importance. And I believe that, there's a way that the American War of Independence ends with American independence absent France, but it is a very long 30-year 40-year long guerrilla struggle that's taking place up in the Appalachian Mountains rather than a sort of what we would consider a quicker and more decisive war that played out, because we got the French Navy. And once we got the French Navy, things started going better for us.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes we don't talk enough about the relationship that the United States has with the French, and that how our statesmen, people like Thomas Jefferson, who's a huge Francophile, and Benjamin Franklin, who's also over there sort of, schmoozing with people and loving the culture and, developing these relationships. These relationships become pivotal in terms of how we think about the construction of the nation and the ideas that spring forth from those cultural connections too.
Yeah. And, it's as I wrote in Hero of Two Worlds, there's at least one sentence in there where it is just the absolute strangest of bedfellows that gets made in this War of Independence, because you're talking about a bunch of colonial, Protestant Anglo farmers and merchants who are going to ally with these French Catholic absolutists. And all through the colonial period, when Europeans started showing up in North America, the conflicts between, the Anglo population sort of in the mid-Atlantic region and the French populations, both up in Canada and down in the Caribbean, those were the central conflicts that the colonists faced, and that the two respective empires recognized, the French and the British. They were just coming out of the 7 Years' War, which was a huge war between the French and the British, and all of the colonists obviously considered themselves British at the time. And so there was, even when Franklin is going over there, they're doing this, the people in the Second Continental Congress, they're doing this very much on the sly, because there's a popular opinion is not necessarily going to be thrilled about the notion that we're getting into bed with the French. And there was a lot of talk, especially up in Boston, that if we go ally with the French, that we will simply be trading one set of colonial masters for another, and that we will simply come under the French auspices and not actually have the independence that they sort of wanted at the time. But when two people share an enemy, we know that the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend. And so there were people in France too that were like, what are you talking about? We're going to go help these Republicans overthrow their king. I don't want to do that. That seems silly. But everybody saw a golden opportunity to stick it to the British. And if you get a golden opportunity to stick it to the British, you go and you do it together.
Yeah. And, part of what you're implying here is there aren't that many, if you go casting about for an ally, there aren't that many choices at this point. And so,
no, that was, that was it. It was really France or bust, because, the Spanish, they were, no. We certainly needed Dutch money, and that was another thing. There was heavy lobbying of the Dutch banks to get us loans, which was also really, really important. But yeah, it was France or bust, I think, in terms of winning that war the way that we did.
Yeah. And, one other interesting thing here is there was also a debate, I think clearly settled at this point, but about the order of operations here. Do you reach out to France in order to then give yourself the ability to declare independence and sort of feel like you're on solid footing? Or do you declare independence, kind of show what you're up to, and then reach out for help? And obviously it worked out largely that, Franklin doesn't go over until after the Declaration of Independence. But, that was an interesting open question as well, tactically.
Yeah, and that was one of the main arguments around independence is when do we do it and why do we do it? And they ultimately decided we need to go to France as something that is a sovereign and independent thing, at least in its own self-conception, and have them sign a treaty with us rather than go begging in a way that is like this. We're still recognizing this as an internal conflict within the British Empire, which I think would have been more difficult for the French to sell themselves on the idea of interfering in the internal affairs of the British Empire openly. They were very happy to do it under the table. And they were doing it under the table forever. Before Franklin even comes, Franklin is coming over partly on the invitation of secret meetings that had gone on between the French and the Congress.
He was part of.
That he was absolutely part of.
Yeah. A little more on that, if you know, and then I want to sort of spin the camera around and look at it from the French perspective. But, what is your sense of why Franklin ends up being the main diplomat here? I mean, part of me is just kind of like, because he's the only one who's over the age of 26 or whatever, and he has a little bit of that gravitas.
He's like 70.
I know. But, that also comes with that.
Even considered
in
the colonial times.
But that also comes with baggage, too, because, I think he really had some British loyalty just because of his age, right? But I'm curious, kind of just Franklin as a figure, if you can paint a picture of why he was the one charged with this, obviously very important task.
He's, I would not go so far as to say he's the only American who could have pulled this off. I do think that there were other people in the movement who probably could have done it. But Franklin is he's the only one that anybody knows over there.
Yeah.
He's a world famous figure. And at that moment, if anyone in Europe knows anybody in America, it's just the one guy, and it's Ben Franklin. And he is worldly, and he is savvy, and he is cultivated and cultured, and he knows how to work a room. He knows how to speak to the people. He knows how to speak to the elites. And so him coming, the very fact of his arrival in France is a cultural moment in France. And he, of course, we all know this, like he plays into this like so much that he's wearing around the beaver skin cap, and he's acting like he's coming out of this like Republican Arcadia that is out there, some utopia. And like many Europeans, we have this myth of the noble savage. Right, which is something that is usually applied to the indigenous populations of North America. But at the time, especially in France, that myth of the quote unquote noble savage, they were including the colonists in that conception. And so like they saw the Americans as potentially something that was they were untouched by the corruption and the decadence of old Europe, and that they were coming out of this sort of pristine utopia. And Franklin is somebody who absolutely knew how to lean into that so much and play into it, because he was, he's like an enlightened merchant. He is not he's not coming out of the wilderness, but I think that's what it is that when Ben Franklin's name and his image is something that is so well known that it gives the colonial cause legitimacy in a way that I don't think anybody else gives it legitimacy.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. He is a celebrity in his day. And so the idea that people want to see him and meet him and have access to him in this way, I think is really powerful and provocative. I think people are also curious as to figure out what he has to offer, or what sort of relationships could develop. So yeah, and if like you say, if there's a dinner that's being held and Ben Franklin is on the guest list, then like you're getting people flocking to that dinner, and he now has access to everybody in a way that, like, there's a guy like Henry Lawrence, he's John Lawrence's father. Maybe he had the chops to do this on like a diplomatic level, but like if Henry Lawrence is coming to dinner, are you getting all of Paris society showing up? No, you're not, man. You want to see Franklin and his silly, coonskin cap. Right.
And Franklin, for his part, seemed to obviously really enjoyed these dinners, and he took part. But yes, he inspired, his face was appearing on jewelry and on medallions, and there were statues. And then he seemingly inspired a women's hairstyle that people started doing their hair a la Franklin. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but, yeah. And so let's do that thing where, you obviously write the book about Marquis de Lafayette. Is there a moment where, Ben Franklin comes sauntering into the room, and is there a relationship there, and what's that like?
Oh yeah, Franklin and Lafayette wind up having a very good relationship, but they miss each other the first time. When Franklin comes over, he is in Paris before Lafayette gets on his own ship and leaves for what is going to become the United States. But Lafayette is in the process of like running away from home and dodging orders from the king not to leave France. So he wasn't making too much contact with anybody. So Lafayette leaves France just as Franklin is arriving. But when Lafayette gets to France, he is this rich 19-year-old noble who is telling people, I'm a marquis. I have come to join the Continental Army. I have a signed commission here from Silas Deane that says I'm a major general in your army. Will you please recognize this? And when he arrives in Philadelphia, they just show up on him and some of these other French officers that he was traveling with. They just show up unannounced in Philadelphia and literally go knock on John Hancock's door and say, hey, we've got these commissions from Silas Deane, your representative back in Paris. You got to make me a major general. And they're looking at him. They're like, you're just some 19-year-old kid. We don't really believe you. We're certainly not going to make you a major general. We would like you to please leave now. We don't need you around. And then they almost literally slamming the door in his face. Hancock sent him down to Robert Morris and said, go talk to Morris. I don't want to talk to you. What gets Lafayette into the army is then a letter arrives from Franklin. One addressed to the Continental Congress and one addressed directly to George Washington saying, look, there's this teenage marquis who might be showing up on your door. He's friends with the king and queen. He knows the foreign minister. He is connected to the most powerful families in France. We need to effect an alliance with the Kingdom of France. And this kid is a direct living link to all those people. He knows them personally. So let him into the army, give him whatever he wants. And then there's a great line in there. It's like, I'm paraphrasing now, but it's basically, for the love of God, don't let him get killed. Because if he dies, we're screwed. Like, this kid has to be protected at all costs. And that's why Lafayette gets into the army. You know, he's there because of his political and his social connections back to the court in France. And nobody thinks he's going to do anything. They think that he's just there. He's just some rich kid having a lark in the woods. And that he'll have his adventure and then he'll go back to France. Nobody really took Lafayette seriously until Lafayette started showing that he was much more than that and wanted much more than that. He wasn't just there to have an adventure and go back. That he was a serious soldier and considered himself to be a serious, political figure on the make. But that's what gets him in is a letter from Franklin.
Wow, talk about a letter of recommendation. I mean,
yeah. Which let's be clear, Franklin wrote a lot of these. Many of them were just full of lies, right? Like the things he's writing for von Steuben, none of it's true. But Franklin's got an eye for town. So the letter that he wrote about Lafayette was true. And then so Lafayette serves in the army for about a year and a half, and then the war hits a bit of a doldrum. And it does become time for Lafayette to do the thing that everybody expected him to do, which is then return to France and use his experience, tell his stories, and gin up excitement for the alliance between France and America. And so when he returns to Paris, during this period, this is when he actually does hook up with Franklin, and the two of them spend, close to a year in very close contact, meeting regularly with each other, meeting regularly with ministers, sort of concocting. Franklin and John Paul Jones and Lafayette dreamed up a scheme to have them raid the British coast to try to hold the British Navy closer to the UK, as opposed to letting them travel across the Atlantic. There's a great thing that I got from Laura Arricchio's book, The Marquis Reconsidered, which is a really good biography of Lafayette. That there was a children's book that Lafayette and Franklin collaborated on. It was sort of like an ABC, it would depict the horrors and atrocities of the British. And it was like E is for execution, all the people that the British execute, those kinds of things. And then woodblock prints of the British doing these horrible war crimes, just as a fun piece of wartime propaganda.
Wow.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
Is this where the two of them sort of come together in terms of their abolitionist ideas? Because I know that Franklin owned enslaved people as a young person, and as he gets older, he frees the slaves. He takes a much more staunch abolitionist stance towards the end of his life. But I wonder if they're also having conversations about how they think about the institution of slavery, which is interesting too, because France has slaves, Great Britain has slaves, the United States, everybody has slaves in the New World. But this idea of abolition is also in the air alongside, you know, the Enlightenment and liberty and freedom and equality and all of these things. How much is that circulating between the two of them?
It's hard to imagine they didn't talk about it. It just is. It's hard to imagine, you know, on Colonel John Lawrence, if you know the Hamilton musical, he's one of Hamilton's close friends and probably a little bit more than that. But Lawrence was an abolitionist too, and Lafayette was in close contact with him for a long time, and he's in close contact with Franklin. During the war period, you know, all the correspondence that I see from Lafayette doesn't speak too much of him yet having any kind of enlightened opinion about slavery or the slaves. But in 1782, just a year after the war is over, he is by that point writing letters to Washington saying, you know, we have won this war for liberty, and so it is time to move on to the next obvious step in that project, which is to free the slaves. We need to get going on emancipation because liberty and slavery are incompatible ideas with each other. And one of the things that I sort of say about Lafayette is, you know, I never found him to be a towering genius. You know, he is in a world with people who are towering geniuses. You know, he knows Napoleon, he knows Robespierre, he knows Thomas Jefferson. Those guys are towering intellects. And Lafayette was a bright guy, but he was never a towering intellect. And so he was never quite able to hold these two ideas of liberty and slavery in his head at the same time. Like, if we did liberty, that means we have to get rid of slavery, right? And his friends among the Virginia plantation owners, who were maybe a bit smarter than him, were able to compartmentalize these two ideas and say, yes, we did fight a war for liberty, and it's great that you think that we should move on to slavery, but it's very complicated and it's hard and we can't do it right now, and all those things that you hear. So Lafayette's own connection to the abolitionist movement begins when he's still in his early 20s. But it's after the war, and I would assume, I didn't see anything, you know, coming out in the primary source documents that say, hey, I was talking to Franklin and we chatted about slavery, and he was like, this is crazy, we should stop it. And I was like, I agree. So I didn't see anything like that.
No, because at the time, I mean, this is what, 1790, Franklin has this petition where he's writing about this great inconsistency, this great hypocrisy, and basically saying, like, we need to, just as you said, we need to deal with this. We need to make the next step of emancipation. And I mean, it takes hold in the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania becomes, you know, this beacon of a free state and really an abolitionist stronghold into the 19th century. But it wasn't like Simon Says. It wasn't like something where the rest of the colonies or states take that on. And
Lafayette was there by the mid 1780s. You know, there's a very great set of letters between him and John Adams when John Adams was the ambassador up to England, saying, I want you to send me a crate of books. I want you to send me everything that's ever been written about slavery and abolitionism, because I'm going to make myself an expert on this subject, because I think this is the next thing that we need to do. And he's saying, like, you know, if I was to look at what's going on over there, like, I'm ashamed at the actions of the white race towards the black race is the way that he's, you know, the language that he's using at the time. So Lafayette is there by the mid 1780s and stays there until he dies in 1834.
Well, luckily, you know, everyone has a very settled and nuanced understanding of the American Revolution as it pertains to slavery, and no one is trying to like politicize that these days or do anything. You know,
really now, really.
But no, hold that thought, because I actually do have a question about that for the end. Yeah. But to return to Franklin, I mean, you know, so as you've been saying, he comes back to the United States with some evolved thinking about the slavery question. He also comes back with a couple other things, including a snuff box filled with 408 diamonds that were gifted to him by King Louis, and just in general, like a real appetite for the high life, it seems like. Which, fine, you're 70, you're on a diplomatic tour, you know, live it up. But this does land him in a bit of hot water back home, where people start to paint Franklin. It's this weird thing, like his reputation only goes up and up and up, but then there's also a lot of sort of looking at him as, this guy's a little, you know, playing it a little fast and loose. He might, one of his fellow diplomats called him the most corrupt of all corrupt men. And these diamonds led to a whole emoluments clause thing, which of course came roaring back in 2017 as a whole issue. But you know, he comes back and with a little bit of I don't know. What do we make of his track record in
scandal,
in France,
sort of?
I suppose?
Listen, you give me a box of diamonds, I'm keeping it. I'm keeping it.
you just retire from public life. You're like, if I'm not allowed to keep this gift and public career, then screw it, I'm out. I think a lot of that really has less to do with Franklin himself, and his particular actions than with the ongoing and what is ongoing during the war and ongoing after the war, which is the division between sort of the Anglophiles and the Francophiles inside the United States, where there were people that, though, Hamilton is one of them, that even though we're fighting to break away from the British, ultimately, like, our commerce and our trade and our political institutions and our societies very much more align with the British than the French, and we don't want to become very, very close to the French. And Franklin is somebody who seemed to be, to those people, like, from the perspective of people who were very skeptical of French intentions, that Franklin seemed to be selling the entire project of the United States to the French wholesale. And that we were just going to be living under the thumb of these French Catholic absolutists, and that Franklin, far from not wanting that to happen, was, like, eager for it to happen and was probably being bribed to make that happen. And so I think it has, like I said, I think it has less to do with Franklin's own actions than with this sort of, like, where do we orient ourselves once we've won the war?
Was there a slight possibility that Americans might be speaking French? That we might be a bilingual country after all.
Right.
And of course, he secures some support, right? And I mean, I think at some basic level, he accomplishes what he was sent to do, which was to strengthen ties
Franklin, he absolutely, he absolutely did what he went to do. And we didn't get sold out to the French, and so I think a lot of that was overblown. And then also many of the promises that the French had made to us during the war about commerce, like, that didn't come true either. There was sort of a pulling away from both sides after the conflict. None of the things that they were actually accusing Franklin of being and doing, like, none of it was really particularly true.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been really fascinating. And, as we wrap up, I did sort of joke earlier about the kind of way in which some of these questions have come roaring back. But I wanted to ask both of you, I get to be the one sort of asking the naive questions to people who actually know their history. That's one of my favorite things to do. But, there is this conversation specifically about, the revolution and what was it fought for, and the slavery question, and was the revolution the thing where where Americans planted their foot and broke from slavery. And, unfortunately, it's, like, contested and politicized in all these really dumb ways. But I'm curious, like, in there is this attempt to paint the founding of this country, as I see it, as, like, sui generis and, like, this unimpeachable sort of moment of clear-eyed values that can't be questioned. And now we can use that to sort of, like, paint a picture of American exceptionalism and so forth. And I mean, I wonder how much just, like, a simple acknowledgement of what we've been discussing here, that there was an exchange of ideas, that there were multiple different countries and multiple different schools of thought, and that we were connected to the rest of the world, how much just that simple fact sort of complicates that story and adds a little bit of perspective.
Well, I mean, a conception that I have formed that I didn't have before I started the Revolutions podcast, but I've now been at it for 9 years, and I did multiple sort of revolutionary theaters during this particular period, especially this age of democratic revolution, is that I no longer believe that the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, Spanish American independence are sort of independent events that are separated from each other. I think it's one giant event that took place that sloshed both ways across the Atlantic. And that there is a huge amount of cross-cultural influence. There's a huge amount of, roles that are played, like the United States goes on to potentially play the role of France when it comes to Spanish American independence. Simón Bolívar is petitioning the U.S. government, like, I need your help to throw off the Spanish. And the United States refused to play the role that France had played for us, and we were not going to get into it. And a lot of that is just because of, national interest. And so now there's sort of the practical needs of now running this independent republic with the ideals that you're supposedly fighting for, which is this anti-colonial liberty and equality. So that's where my head is at with that the United States of America as a thing is not this unique beacon that grew sui generis out of the forests of Arcadia here in the New World. It is a project that was planted by one particular European power that was in contact and conflict with all the other European powers, and that it grew out of a mixture of practical self-interest, improvisation, mistakes, that it was geniuses doing works of genius as opposed to human beings muddling along through very difficult periods, sometimes getting it right, sometimes getting it very wrong, sometimes being massive hypocrites, sometimes, yes, absolutely, setting a course that allows in the future for great accomplishments to be made and great progress to be made in terms of human rights, but which they themselves immediately started to resist. So the whole thing is just it's just a messy mess because it's human beings doing things.
There are no clear lines.
No, there's really not. Nobody comes out untainted. Nobody comes out. There's no perfect villains. I don't know. Jefferson's getting there a little bit, but just a little editorializing on the way out the door.
No, I think that's spot on. I mean, I have to do this in my class all the time, where it's just like, it's complicated. I mean, that's the simple answer. It's complicated, but that people are complex, and you can absolutely be an awesome military general and a slaveholder, right? Like you can be really thoughtful on the battlefield and really violent and horrific on your plantation. And those people occupied the same space. And so I think we have to be able to tease out these identities. Even someone like Franklin, who was a slaveholder and then pivots and changes, who published the advertisements for the purchase of slaves and published like abolitionist opinion pieces from Quakers. Like he did both. So it's never, no pun intended, but it's never black or white.
Yes. Yeah. And he did that like a good merchant should. There's if you want to know what the through line of those things are. I'm so
green and gold.
I'm so cynical sometimes.
I know, but I was about to say, that's the satisfying answer is there's no tidy explanation, but maybe you just did land on it. It's just money. But yes, I mean, thank you for both for saying that, and that but it is the case that the idea that it's complicated just breaks some people's brains, and they just can't. And so we're all trying to unbreak them as much as possible in our work. And so, Mike, thank you again for doing this. And of course, go read the book, Marquis de Lafayette, go listen to all the podcasts. But then I mentioned you are on tour. When people are listening to this, you will be out and about. And I gather you were just on a book tour, but this series of shows in October, and we'll put a link to it in a show description and so forth. But this is doing something a little different, right?
Yeah. I just wrapped up 3 weeks on the road for the paperback release of Hero 2 Worlds, which was great. But in October, I'm playing Austin and San Francisco and Seattle, and then later in the month, I'll be doing Boston and Washington D.C. and Newark, New Jersey. And this is a monologue piece that I have written and am going to be performing about historical storytelling and narrative building, because as a species, what humans are is fundamentally as storytellers. And that's how we relate to each other. It's how we identify ourselves in the world. It's how we communicate about the places that we've been and who we are as people. But when you meet people for the first time, we're mostly engaging in acts of historical storytelling. Where did I go to school? Where did I grow up? Who my family is, these kinds of things. And we do this for the societies that we live in too. We just did it a bunch here today. We're trying to tell more complicated stories about what the American Revolution meant or what the French Revolution meant, but figuring out the societies that we live in and what they mean comes from these acts of narrative storytelling. And so we treat that as sometimes just a subgenre of literature or a subgenre of the discipline, when really what it is how our brains organize all of existence. And so I will spend,
in 90 tidy minutes.
It's a tight 75.
I love it. It's the greatest pitch for history I've ever heard.
Yeah. So it's a tight 75 on the meaning and nature of historical storytelling.
Well, there you go. Well, Mike, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks a lot.
And Kelly Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.